Hey everybody, welcome into WURD Radio's Progressive Politics Roundtable discussion, live from our WURD Radio studios. I'm your host, Keaton Nichols, host of the lounge here at WURD, and I'm excited to have these fine folks in front of me today to discuss progressive politics and its reach in communities of color. First up, let's meet our panelists. To my left, Chris Rogers is core member of the Teacher Action Group here in Philly. He's also public programming director at the Paul Robeson House Museum here in Philly as well. So welcome, Chris. Also, Kwasa Mathis is a producer here at WURD of the show Wake Up with WURD. She's also digital media coordinator here for WURD Radio as well. Yashira Rivera is WURD events coordinator and NTR coordinator as well. We'll look forward to her voice in this conversation, as well as Stephanie Renee, host of The Source, right here at WURD as well, and handles our online content at WURD. I welcome all of you all to the panel, and thank you all for taking the time out today to talk about this very important subject. Very important subject. All right, so without further ado, let's get started, right? Progressivism in American politics, traditionally this idea that refers usually to reforming some sort of social aspects of the country for good. So this has taken on several different forms, in the United States over the years. And really most recently, one of the more popular voices in the country right now, political voices in the country, has been independent Senator Bernie Sanders. He's done a lot to sort of define what progressive politics means in American politics here today. Many people, especially young folks, have taken a keen interest in this particular approach to politics, as it offers something a little bit different from traditions of the Democrat and actually also the Republican Party. But it's also become clear that these policies, while they have made a dent in the Democratic establishment, still exactly don't resonate as well in communities of color. So I kind of want to start there in this conversation with this. I mean, why do you all think that the Bernie Sanders brand of progressive politics doesn't work as well for non-whites? And also, you can be more specific, non-white males, which this message has really resonated in this country. What do you all think?
Well, I'll jump in as a lifelong registered independent. I think it's important to define what progressive actually means. And for me, progressive means having a keen insight into where we are in the present and being able to move forward with our political views and our policies from where we are now. I think a lot of people, when they look at the political sphere, there, especially when it comes to white males, people look backwards and think about the origins of politics in this nation and what they feel are some of the foundational principles upon which this country was founded. And they're trying to get to a platform that elevates that idea. Progressive politics to me is saying that's what we needed at the founding, and now we are in 2018 trying to move forward, and so there are policies that need to be more reflective of the people that live here now, about the needs of the people that live here now, and that looks a whole lot different from the founding fathers. So progressive politics needs to be in that kind of frame of mind if it's going to take more of the perspective of people of color into consideration. And I think a lot of individuals need to make peace with what they mean when they say progressive in order for us to get there. Because unless you're looking here forward, you're not going to take these various communities that we're going to be speaking about largely today into consideration in that way.
Very good point. Very good point. I know that this is, kind of a subject, during the primary race. Of course, Bernie Sanders is facing off with Hillary Clinton. In many ways, this represented so many things, that were happening, I think, live to really, people would argue, the Democratic Party, that this is where it really had its greatest impact, that there seems to be a split in understanding almost between what the traditions are of the Democratic Party and what this progressive movement seems to be pushing more towards. As these sort of non-traditional voters, as people think of them, these non-white voters, I felt like we found ourselves sometimes in between those two sort of establishments, if you will, right? The traditional Democratic Party, which kind of moved more to the center over the last couple of years, and then this progressive movement, which is definitely pushing for change, something that we in the in communities of color understand that we need, but we couldn't find ourselves anywhere in between that. That disconnect during the course of the election, what was missing about that movement, in your opinion, that sort of missed the ball with African Americans, with women as well? Big part of this as well. What was kind of missing out of that piece?
I think that what was missing is that there are conservative Democrats, those who look at policies that only benefit only a small group of people, not everyone, when it comes to certain things that are going into play. So that is why so many individuals who are registered as a Democrat, or like Hillary, or not so much Hillary, but there are, even in Philadelphia, those who aren't fully for reproductive or women's rights that call themselves Democrats. So that's where those who are progressive like myself say, well, yes, I'm a registered Democrat, but this guy does not support, or this guy or woman does not support women's rights or the right to choose and things like that. So I think that's where it kind of is in the middle. And it's not even just reproductive rights and justice. You know, you have gun reform. There's a lot of different topics where it's in that middle, because they're trying to get votes from, have individuals who are Republicans swing over to be Democratic, and they're trying just to get the vote regardless of what they say or do. So I think that's where it kind of falls into play, where we're kind of in the middle.
I also kind of think that the Democratic Party has become lazy in a sense as well.
What do you mean by that specifically?
So specifically, I mean that because for so long people of color, especially African Americans, have voted along Democratic lines, you know, you're seeing that they feel like they don't have to, I guess, pander to our votes anymore. And so when things like that happen, we see that they kind of become lax in the policies that they push, and, you know, similar to even what Yashira was saying. So I think that they've become, you know, very laxed. They really don't seem to necessarily care about people of color as much as they should, and they also are not even having people on their platforms that speak to us and that speak to the types of policies that we need to see in our communities.
And I would sort of just to, one of the things that we've been noticing at Teacher Action Group, and I think and particularly in education, is that there's been a long history of corporate Democrats in this country, and the effects that it has on education, where we think about the sort of like rise of quote unquote school choice as this sort of like marketplace for, you know, children and families to choose the best option, really like recreating this sort of like portfolio investment model in the schools, which comes out of sort of like this Wall Street aesthetic. And I think with the sort of like rising importance of, you know, campaign finance and these decisions, it has really led the Democrats to really be like directly tied to Wall Street in a way where the way they think about policies doesn't step away from these financial sort of like backbone decisions in the way that as a sort of like people struggle we need to be able to do if we're thinking about, you know, taking our money away from the sort of like banking and financial sort of you know, capitalist model that we have, and reinvesting back into social programs and people. So I think they've been sort of beholden to those interests, and that's one way that has worked on education. But there's also a great book by Naomi Morikawa about how liberals built the prison regime, right? And she goes all the way back until like the sort of like 60s, up until, you know, a huge moment is sort of like that crime bill that, you know, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton did in the 90s, where you're seeing how like liberal or quote unquote Democrat or quote unquote progressive talk has like been tied to creating this prison regime based on sort of like drug war, the sort of like war on poverty in black communities. So there's a long history of in the sort of like quote unquote progressive movements that these reforms are like built on the exclusion or on the backs of you know, black and brown people. And that, you know, that goes all the way back. Keonga Taylor also talks about you know, look at, you know, the New Deal and how many sort of like black and brown people
progressive idea.
Right,
Yeah,
are
rooted.
excluded from that, right? So there's a long history of that, and I think that mistrust, right, based on a real legacy of exclusion, is still here, right? And that's something that the Democrats and, you know, white folks in general need to be able to like working on to fix.
I want to jump into that just to touch on points that both Kwasa and Chris just made. I had the pleasure of co-moderating conversation about the Latino vote with Aldea just before the 2016 election. And one of the things that former SRC member Farah Jimenez said, as a registered Republican, very outspoken in terms of that, is that one of the things that people of color have not gotten, particularly from the Democratic Party, is that you have to have demands going in. That we've given up our voice and our vote for cheap for years, and that there has to be a mentality of, if I'm going to vote in a particular way, I expect to get results from that. And if we're talking about progressive politics, that's something that I feel we have to cash in on. That there needs to be an idea of, if you feel you have been traditionally excluded, if you have receipts, as Chris just offered, of examples where these policies and practices have not worked to the benefit of the constituencies that you represent, then you've got to go in with demands. That's the only way that we're going to have a progressive voice coming forth with things that are going to benefit our communities.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, we actually had a conversation off air about, what certain entities, or whether or not a certain political figure might be considered progressive simply because of who they are. They're just inherently progressive. A lot of times, especially in our communities, we say, look, we got to get more black and brown representatives to sit in these seats, to ensure, that some of those objectives that we were talking about in our community get addressed. And there are some folks that I think feel that the person, or can sometimes take on the idea of progressivism just by being black, or by being a woman, or by being a part of the LGBTQ community, or being a Latina or Latino. Inherently within that, is there some credence to that truth that us as black people, or as minorities just in general, can inherently kind of be progressive, even if we share certain views or have certain views that might be problematic, right?
I have two names for you.
Okay.
Ben Carson, Clarence Thomas.
There you go.
The whole islands of Puerto Rico at times, because they tend to vote Republican, and we have to acknowledge that, and especially in the Latino community, they tend to be very conservative in a lot of different situations. Patriarchy, I feel, plays one of the huge parts in that, and also different types of religion. And not just because you are a woman or a Latino, African American, doesn't make you progressive. We automatically, and what happens is, a lot of times in politics, they sell that. Like, I'm a woman, vote for me. I'm Latino, vote for me. I'm African American, and so forth, vote for me. But in reality, it's more than just that. Like, you have to really look into their policies and what they're looking to doing, to whether or not it's going to actually help the community. And too often, I kind of feel that we don't do that as voters. We're kind of just like, oh, they're black, and you see their name on a poll, and you vote for them. Same way a lot of people said, hey, the reason why Barack Obama was in office is because he's African American. But you can see that a lot of white folks also voted for him as well. Yeah. So we have to look into that just because you come with a certain title or come from a specific community doesn't make you progressive.
Right, I agree. And even, we're talking about this too, and talking about voting and how important it is to vote, in the community. We also have to remember that you need to be an educated voter as well. You can't just go out there and say, oh, you're black, I'm going to vote for you, or because not everybody who is your color or your gender is going to put your voice out there. And so I think that we have to remember that as well. Just because you're going in and, pushing, a vote for a specific candidate just because of the way that they look doesn't necessarily mean that they're there for you.
And one of the things I definitely want to add on to this is, I think sometimes there's a way when we think about politics or progressive politics, it becomes a matter of looking at, federal elected officials. But when we drop it down and think about our elected local representatives and the amount of blind faith almost that they expect from the black community. Now, I'm from Chester. We share a lot of sort of like relationships with Philly. Representative Brady also is our representative down there. But the amount of the lack of education around issues that comes out of a number of our local officials' offices, right? Where folks just say, well, we did a town hall or we did a meeting, why weren't you at the meeting? And then expect people, right, to be educated about the issues or how they should choose. that is a totally failed system, right? And I think that when we talk about changing from this sort of like mode of seeing the representative as the person we trust to be able to make decisions on behalf of the community, it begins with changing how we do political education.
Yeah.
It goes back to, in my work with schools and thinking about how we educate children around this sort of like civic responsibility. Right. And I have been particularly appalled. So right now I live in North Philly in 22nd District. One of the struggles that we have is with stadium stoppers in the stadium, and sort of like this Temple Stadium. And just it took Darrell Clark a really long time to come out and stand up with the stadium stoppers around that, and he still feels a little bit edgy to me. But I think that educating folks around the sort of like the impact of that, right, or having our folks really think about these things and the choices that can be made, feels like such a lost part of what we do.
Yeah. I mean, that civic education and engagement piece of this, I think, is also very key. There's a lot of folks also that can find themselves wanting to challenge a lot of these systems that we have now, but find it kind of frustrating in that same sense if there's not really a place for them to voice their concerns. If the Democratic Party, which oftentimes will lean towards that, those progressives, and oftentimes like to even claim that title. I even remember, the election of our current mayor. There's a write-up in Huffington Post that says, Philly's 99th mayor is the new progressive mayor of, and I remember that word, kind of being put on it and thinking, well, what inherently, other than him being a Democrat, makes him a progressive? And so, to your point about, sort of local representatives, as well, does it feel to you sometimes like the local progressive movement, or those that are considered progressives, are missing a black voice, missing black people at the table? Is that maybe a piece of this conversation that becomes difficult?
Well, I think because a lot of people have become disenchanted with the political process, that there is, there's a disconnect in Philadelphia in particular between grassroots activists and the political machine. And so a lot of the people that are doing progressive work are not seen as elevated voices in the political spectrum. They're the folks who are out going door to door, having the meetings, providing the services, doing the civic education in a way that is very beneficial to the community. Yeah. But the fight for funding and other political impact of the work that they are doing is not necessarily fully realized because it's such a separate environment in this city. In other places, particularly on the West Coast, the kind of difference between the grassroots activists and the political machine is not so distant. They're very much integrated, and and some of these grassroots organizations work very purposefully to try and get at least one representative added to city council or added into the committees that are making the decisions about appropriations and what have you, so that the work can continue to be supported by the political machine. Right. In Philadelphia, we don't have that formula down yet, I don't think.
And I think, it's interesting that you say that in a Democratic hotspot like Philadelphia, when we're still doing, autopsies on the 2016 election, trying to figure out what exactly went wrong. Where do we go wrong with this? Pennsylvania is a state, that went red. Correct. Kind of in that sense. And a lot of folks were looking at, well, where's the black vote at? Where's the, the women's vote? Where's the black women's vote at? Where's the black male vote? All these things seem to be pretty traditionally, in the Democratic House. Like, it seemed as though the loyalty, if you will, for lack of a better term, to the Democratic Party was certainly there. But in other areas that say, like Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan became these really important sort of they lost these blue-collar sort of white male workers for the majority of them. Does the progressive the definition of the progressive movement that we have right now, does it sort of chase after those people for election strategy to get numbers? And is that kind of ruining the moral value of wanting to, really make change and affect change in government? Do you think that's happening?
I think that when you look at the progressive movement, I think you're correct, right? So It caters more to, I guess, those white, blue collar workers. And when you look at the history of the progressive movement, African Americans and people of color, LGBTQ community, they have been basically kind of removed from that conversation. No one really, kind of pulls them in to talk about policies. And I think even with what Steph was saying, as far as people are feeling, disenfranchised, it's because of the fact that, you work so hard to kind of push legislation and push policy, and then you continue to see that, these policies are not working for people of color. I think we were even talking, the other day about the fact that all men should have equal protection under the law, right? But because of racism, that doesn't actually happen. And so I think that when we are talking about or having this progressive conversation, we also need to think about how racism and how the history of America being built on racism, how that impacts voters, how that impacts people of color when we're having this conversation.
And just to add to that, when it comes to Pennsylvania, I don't want to give an exact figure, but Pennsylvania is, I think, top 5 in the United States for white supremacist and national groups.
Yeah.
And so when we think about that, Pennsylvania, when you live in Philly, and those who grew up in Philly, can't even imagine something like Charlottesville happening in this community, because it wouldn't happen. Yeah. You travel an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half. I can speak from experience because I am from central Pennsylvania. I mean, growing up, I literally was the pepper and everybody else was salt, or whatever analogy you want to use, but just know there wasn't many of me. Yeah. And it's very alive and real. I remember growing up, the Ku Klux Klan had a rally at our municipality when I was going into high school. And just knowing that my dad had to rush to pick me up because he was concerned of my safety. This happened, let's say I was a teenager, so maybe 15 years ago, in that community. And in Philly, when Charlottesville happened, it was such a shock, like, oh my God, how can this happen? Good afternoon, Philadelphia. This is happening an hour from your center city. And so Kwasa and, Stephanie's point, racism is very alive and real. This isn't something new. We know this is the foundation of this nation. And the reason to why people of color and the LGBTQ community and those whose voices are very important are not being heard of, especially in those regions, is because I don't want to say that they don't care, but they don't care. They don't care. They're not interested in hearing what the black and brown vote or those are saying, because it's two completely playing fields. And what I've seen happen, especially in the politics in my hometown, is like you have those progressives that are openly gay who are going for mayor, and then you have those that still believe that at 10 o'clock you shouldn't cross the railroad tracks. I mean, that's literally the severity, and I'm not trying to be dramatic and try to be negative, but I mean that's a fact. And one of the personal reasons to why I moved to Philadelphia is because I am in an interracial relationship, and the amount of harassment that we received because of our relationship, or the amount of harassment I just get in general, speaking Spanish in public or just walking down the street, I mean, it's alive and real. So we really have to have an in-depth conversation about racism in politics, because
it's almost like it's being ignored.
Oh, it's 100%, because nobody ever wants to talk about it. Right. Everybody wants to label this or that. And, what did that person do to receive that type of treatment always tends to be the beautiful conversation in America recently. So what did those two guys do at Starbucks to get dragged out? Yeah, right. What did they do? I'm like, and I was like, so, I mean, what can you possibly do in less than 2 minutes? Like, I'd be pumped to see what they did in those 2 minutes, because I can tell you, I mean, it takes just 2 minutes to get in line at Starbucks. So
yeah. Like, it's hard to cause a disturbance.
Like, by the time I get a straw, a napkin, and add sugar, that's at least 15 minutes. I could do some damage in 15 minutes, but less than 2, I don't know.
Give me a few.
I don't know, but that's just that.
Yeah, and I will also add, like, just in thinking about that question, like, the reverse is also true of how white communities are, brainwashed into believing that certain policies are, like, for just black people, or just for
that's a good point.
The LGBTQ community, or just, and how that has particularly this whole like law and order narrative, right? How much money and investment we are like moving away from like social programming and into police forces is like huge, or into the military defense fund is huge.
Yes, exactly.
And I think like an example of that, like my sort of like favorite example going back to, is like this sort of like welfare to work movement, right?
Yes.
And how the sort of like narrative of the black woman as the welfare queen was used to really dismantle a program that really allowed a number of families, and statistically way more white families than black families, to really like maintain a home and maintain food, right? Now we have a huge problem with hunger. And so like when we think about all the ways that other communities are at the specter of like black folks or Latino communities are used to be able to like mobilize policies, it's definitely a truth, right? And I think in the way that we sort of like come back around that is like President Barack had, he had some policies that I don't agree with, but one of the things he did say was like, when we focus on the sort of like policies and we focus on these issues, when we talk about like employment and labor unions, we know that's going to have a greater impact for black and brown folks. But does that mean that we have to say that when we are like promoting it? And I think that is a conversation that we're still having around, and particularly from like an organizing or grassroots struggle of like, what does multiracial organizing look like, and how we use our rhetoric and our sort of like display to really mobilize a critical mass to make sure that these policies happen.
Well, one of the other things that I think is important as we start to frame our arguments around progressive politics is also that naming is important, right? Because we have allowed a narrative to persist, especially as it relates in welfare or food benefits and whatever. We call them entitlement programs. Entitlement programs implies that you expect to receive it and that it will always be there.
Right.
And that there's this insidious little whisper of laziness that is involved if you're receiving them, right? So then not only do we have to constantly fight to prove the need for programs like this to persist, but then people want to start doubling down and then policing how the programs are utilized by individuals. So one of the things that annoys me to no end, that I think is these impossible arguments that we find ourselves in, and we never get to the root of stabilizing the programs and making sure they're reaching who they need to go to, is something like food benefits, SNAP benefits, and now you want to either drug test people to make sure that they can still receive them, or you want to police the way that they spend it. Right? So that if you find a way, if you have a special occasion, we're in the midst of graduation season, right? If you wanted to do a special dinner where you had a decent steak or some nice seafood or things like that, there are elected officials in this nation who would like to say that if you receive benefits, basically you don't get a chance to have a nice meal. If you find a way to work it out in your budget with the benefits that you are allotted, they now want to prevent you from being able to buy certain goods for, using those benefits. Come on.
Really trying to define and limit what people's actions are behind these things. You're already in a limited scope because you're on a need-based sort of status. And now trying to further define that.
I just want to add to that. I'm just really confused to why the marketing and the propaganda that politicians dish out have zero accountability. Because what happens is, especially in the instance of welfare and SNAP, and they always gear it towards the poor little African-American or Latino mom that needs help. Firstly, the majority of people that do receive government funding in Pennsylvania in that regard work.
Yes.
They work. And like every time that I say this in real life, they're like, well, they need to work for their money, and people with disabilities need to work, and they shouldn't just get a handoff and this and this and this and that. Newsflash, they're already working. With inflation and the fact that our minimum wage is literally pennies compared to how much you spend on a daily basis, that's the legitimate problem. That's what we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at, okay, our hourly wage. We need to be looking at, why are these people still in poverty? Okay, we need to look at systemic oppression. And nobody ever has that discussion. They have these awful propaganda videos that those who vote for these politicians just eat up. They eat it up like popcorn with their sunglasses on at the movie theater, and nobody says anything about it. Where is the accountability of feeding the masses inaccurate information? And when is there going to be accountability? Honestly,
So just like to add to that, I think one of the things, I was teaching a course at Washington University a couple years ago, and it was like around sort of like safety and sustainability of communities. And one of the things that I noticed in that course, which I have like continued to see everywhere since then, is like this increasing of this sort of like taxpayer mindset of like you are only as, you know, you only deserve as much as you're contributing, right, into a system. And I think sometimes even in the black community, we sort of like use this logic of like, but I pay taxes, so I deserve this, or I'm a black homeowner. That means that I should be looked at versus the other people who are renting,
Renters,
right?
yeah.
And I think that's this way that the quote unquote like progressive line has been like divided against one another of like who's a taxpayer and who's paying for these programs.
Who's putting in on this?
Right. So you got a J. Cole song on this new album where he spends a whole verse talking about, well, my tax money goes to this,
Brackets.
and my tax money goes to this,
Yeah.
and my tax money goes to that. And I think that is one way in which we're playing into a narrative that moves us away from actually thinking about how we govern society, what the least of these have, right? Which should be like what a progressive mindset is, and moves into this sort of like what's realistic, what can we quote unquote afford, and it just becomes this way of governing society based on productivity, which, you know, kind of comes back to capitalism, but it just
And what you said about the banks.
right.
Yeah,
So
that mentality.
I recognize that, and I also think about the ways that like internally, like in the black community, we have come to espouse that sort of way of like, well, where's my money going, and not thinking about like what everyone needs around us. How are we feeding the masses, as Yashira put?
Yeah, absolutely. Just real quick to remind folks, our panel in front of me, we got Chris Rogers, Kwasa Mathis, Yashira Rivera, Stephanie Renee, all participating in this conversation. And of course, those folks listening on the radio version of this right now, definitely hit us up on social media and let us know what you think about this as well. And if you guys are watching the video from this, leave us comments as well, because we definitely want to be able to continue this conversation as well. And a couple of things, I believe it was you, Steph, that kind of brought up this concept that there are, you know, I don't want to say real progressives that are doing real work on the street, but you got people who are at sort of that grassroots sort of level, that on the ground sort of level, that are dealing with these issues. Yashira, we've talked about this too, you know, where there's so much of this groundwork that goes into ensuring that persons in our communities that we find, you know, need protections. We represent those people, or the people on the ground sort of are doing work every single day, but that message doesn't exactly resonate, or I'm sorry, it doesn't exactly reach Congress all the time, or our elected representatives, whether or not that's state level, you know, locally here at city council, you know, whatever else like that. And so this is kind of a solutions-based kind of thing too. I mean, if you kind of put on your all-rolling hat here, you know, what are some ways that we could, I don't want to say bridge that gap, that almost seems too easy, but what are ways that we can sort of make sure that the movements that are going on that seem pretty accurate to the concerns of the people in the street actually reach either the legislator or folks that are in power, like a district attorney or attorney general for the state, whatever. How can it reach these persons so that they can actually affect real change?
Well, I think sometimes the ask is too late if you're waiting until the people who are currently in office are the ones that pick up the mantle of this. I think one of the things that I stress when we talk about voters and voter education on the air, on my show, I tell people all the time that primaries and general elections are to hire and fire. And so we've got to approach the political process in a way that says, I'm paying attention to what you are saying in order to get in office. And then from day one that you sit behind that desk and that you start contributing to this political process, I'm still watching you to make sure that you follow through with the things that you told me were priorities that I felt represented me. Now, if I see you're working on it and you're up against some issues, then I can ride with you for a while if you stay to the cause.
Right.
If now you flip the script and you are comfortable and you are not rocking a boat or holding up the mantle of an issue that I think is important, come the next election, you gotta go. And we have to be in that show me the receipts mentality when it comes to this. Otherwise, just things
You
will
can't just
continue
expect
to
folks to do
plod
this,
along,
you know,
right?
because they traditionally haven't.
And I think the other piece too is that, also increasing your civic engagement, right? So, I mean, even if you are out here, whispering in somebody's ear, in a candidate's ear, and you're like, okay, I'm, going to vote for you, and they don't get into office. Oh man, what do I do? Well, whoever got into office, still hold them accountable.
Yeah.
Still make sure
correct.
that you're calling them up, that you're writing them letters, that you're doing what you need to do to make sure that your voice is heard. So, don't let the fact that because your candidate didn't get into office, make it so that you don't want to, be a part of the process anymore. You still need to be a part of the process. You still need to make sure that you stand up and be counted. So, I mean, I think that we have to look at it on both aspects. Yes, start from the ground and, yes, whisper in these people's ears when they're going in. But even if your candidate doesn't make it, make sure that you're calling them. Make sure you're holding them accountable for the things that they're doing while they're in office.
And I always come back to James Baldwin has this amazing quote, like, you have to demanding the impossible is the least that we can do. And when I think about that, and I think about engagement, and I think about how we hold folks accountable, particularly as someone who has like a couple degrees and has like a bit of mobility, I think it's really important that folks like myself are continuing to push the line of like how our policies and how really reaching the sort of like working class and the folks that have been deemed, disposable or undeserving, because we really have to be, pushing the limit on that. So one of the things I really love about like grassroots struggle is that we're beginning to like put visions out there that are like really, really forward, and a lot of people would say are impossible. I like one of the things I really love of like the Coalition of Real Justice. I think they might have changed their name now, but they have, they're right now abolition of policing, right? And moving towards a different way of community safety, a way of solving for harm, right? Because we recognize that policing has failed us, right? So what are the other sort of avenues that we can begin to put in place so that we have, supports? And so thinking about, mental health, thinking about economic imperatives, right? One of the things I think that like we really need to be talking about, and I wish I saw more from the Congressional Black Caucus on this, is Pennsylvania. We're rolling into this sort of like medical marijuana, and then the legalization of marijuana, right? And we all know, and we all saw the documentaries about how sort of like the war on drugs was used to disenfranchise, Black communities, right? And we all probably got family that's that's suffering from these consequences. So when we think about what that looks like for Pennsylvania, and I know right now the policies are already messed up, but when we think about this change that's coming, because the state's going to need the revenue, they can't build a casino on every block. They can try, but when we think about that, how are we really pushing the Black community to be like at the forefront of this, right? Because these same instances were used to disenfranchise communities. So when we think about what's next, we have to think about this economic opportunity. And I see that as connected to this form of like abolition mindset that's saying, how do we move away from this punitive way and thinking about empowerment? Like the Coalition for Real Justice, I think has done a great job in the streets every day, like really bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I think that one of the best ways is community engagement. I think that telling the masses or telling communities the facts and the importance to why you should support organizations that speak and gear directly towards certain issues, volunteer, become a board member, organize an event, organize a panel discussion. I think too often we get so involved in just voting and not really educating people in advance. And there's so many organizations in Philly. There's so many nonprofits. There's so many for-profit businesses. If there's something that really grinds your gears, go to that organization and say, hey, I'm really passionate about this topic. I really want to create change and start to educate the community. How can I do that? And I feel that that's a part of it that a lot of people miss. Less Facebook arguments, more community engagement.
Amen. Amen. And you had brought up the word disposables, almost reminded me of the deplorables, sort of comment. And the reason why I made that connection is because the deplorables that Hillary Clinton had referenced, it was a slip of the tongue. We shouldn't have heard that or whatever, but it happened. Okay, it's out there now. So this deplorables group actually ends up being a driving engine force behind the political movement that we see that wound up, giving us Donald Trump, as president. And there was something about that. There was something about Hillary Clinton's, calling these people deplorables because I felt, this is my interpretation, I kind of felt like she felt they were out of the process. These are people who are too wild and who have absolutely no real semblance of how things work. And so therefore their opinion can be marginalized, right? We can throw them over into a category, a basket, if you will, of deplorables. And I think sometimes when you talk about organizations that propose really, you can argue progressive policies like
Right.
the abolition of police, right? That's something that I'd be like, hey, hang on. Can we talk about this for a second? Because, I think we still need police. Well, there are these conversations that sometimes in a raw form, might make people say, well, how could you believe in that? Like, I understand where you're coming from, but isn't that a little extreme? I think sometimes that puts people in a these disposables kind of in a box where we say, like the deplorables, well, your opinion doesn't really matter because we're dealing with real stuff here. Mm-hmm. You are living in the fantasy land of progressivism and free college and all this other stuff, but here's the real world and you need to get with the program. Does that sort of mentality about where, liberal politics or democratic politics or wherever are, does that, do you think, further push people away from participating in the process at all? And do we need the opinions of these folks who are considered in some aspects extremists? Do we need those ideas to kind of help center us all, whatever political thing we're trying to do here?
This is a numbers game, right? Mm-hmm. So what I love about the way Chris lined up that argument about being able to dream the impossible and then see it through to fruition, mm-hmm. is that you got to know the numbers of how many people you need to get in your ball game in order to push that legislation through where you are and how that works. That's why we can't afford to disenfranchise ourselves from the political process, mm-hmm. because the people that get funding for skate parks over schools, and no offense to the skater folks. Sure. I'm just saying, but I mean, we talk about lobbies, right? We have bike lanes throughout the city Absolutely. Of Philadelphia. Most people that are in some of these neighborhoods that I drive through, they're not riding bicycles. No. But the bike lobby had a very well structured, organized, single-minded focus on trying to get these things to happen. And they got enough people to advocate that position in order to get bike lanes painted in our already narrow streets in this old city. Mm-hmm. You understand what I'm saying? So mm-hmm. there's a reality that we need to face in terms of how you take the grassroots activism and progressive ideas mm-hmm. and play the numbers game and find your advocates and in the grant making community, they call it water bearers. Yeah. The people who are going to take this issue as far as they possibly can within the scope of their positions mm-hmm. and get it done. Yeah. Plain and simple. You got to get it done.
You know what's funny about that example is the same people who probably like lobby for bike lanes are probably the same people who are like lobbying for like why black kids are riding down the street, making wheelies on bikes, dirt bikes. And it's, right. But it's like but somehow we want bikes, but only these type of bikes in this sort of white lane. Right, if you step outside of that white lane, we're not protecting you anymore.
Right, yeah.
So and that's the way this sort of like progressivism line sort of like happens and divides folks.
I think that people too often try to take credit or are being very self-centered when they're trying to create change. And the reason why I say that is because I'm sure there are groups in the city that all agree that one thing will change, and instead of working together, they work alone. So I think it's very important, and I think that it's very important. And I'm not saying that they're trying to take credit or it's selfishness, and that's not what I'm trying to say. I would love to hear advice from any of you on the panel to what it is. But if there are 6 organizations that all have a great approach, like Stephanie Renee mentioned, and they all, unite like the Avengers, right? And then they try to create policy, I think that would be more productive than having 6 separate groups with not as much ammo trying to go up against the government. Absolutely. And I don't see too much of that. You know, when it comes to collaboration and community and teamwork, I feel like that's one thing that's really, really, really missing in the community. And I feel that if we tighten up that a bit, I think more issues can be tackled in a shorter time frame instead of having 100 people trying to do one thing.
So like when we talk about you know, having 6 random organizations that are all kind of pushing for certain things, I guess my question would be, you know, how do we as people of color kind of infiltrate those organizations? How do we get into those organizations and really kind of make our voice known? I mean, throughout history, we see that, you know, specifically, I'll just speak to Black women because that's what I can speak to right now. But specifically, you know, Black women have, you know, wanted to kind of get their voice heard in the mix when you're talking about the suffrage movement, right? And a lot of white women were like, no, you know, we don't really want you to be a part. You're not really a woman like we are. And so I kind of, this is not to poo-poo on anything. I just kind of, for me, I want to know, what do we need to do in order to get in there, get in the mix, and make it so that whenever we're pushing for these specific policies, how do they become beneficial for people who look like us in this room?
Yeah, well, I've had this conversation. You know, I feel like I'm the elder in the room right now.
Just barely.
And I've and I've had this conversation with other elders in the city, and they've basically told me that what we have in Philadelphia, and that's why the framing this conversation around progressive politics, I think, is really important. We have establishment in Philadelphia. It's one of the oldest cities, and we have very traditional ways of looking at problems and looking at how we're supposed to manage problems and get to a solution. One of the words in the Black community that people have stepped away from because it is so charged is radical.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right.
And so somewhere in a conversation about progressive politics and how do we make change is an embracing of the things that other people have thrown away. We've had this conversation a lot about the N-word, but we won't get into that today. But the idea of progressive really meaning progressive and radical being radical, that fantasy idea of something that will benefit our community and saying that we are ready to pursue that is not going to happen within the context of most of the established organizations, especially in a city like Philadelphia, because people are too busy with titles and perceived power rather than actual movement and policy making that's going to benefit the people that should be being served by a lot of these organizations.
Word.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that struggle of like around ideas and around this sort of like setting the agenda of what policies represent our community is one that has to happen in the streets, you know?
Yeah.
And like going back to the election example, it wasn't until, you know, Bernie Sanders got interrupted in Seattle that 2 days later, all of a sudden he has a racial justice page on his website.
And Simone Sanders is now running his campaign.
Right. And it wasn't until, you know, Hillary Clinton got interrupted that all of a sudden now we go to the Democratic convention. It's like, wow, look at all these black women up here on the stage. So I think like this, you know, these practices of interruption, you know, this like of disruption of getting the message out there has to happen, and it's a struggle that we have to see. And I think like coming back to these more sort of like, you know, radical ideas. And I remember Angela Davis had this awesome quote, like radical means going to the root cause, right? So we have to think systemically, right?
Yes.
We have to recognize that United States has been built on enslavement of black people and the genocide of Native Americans, right? So when we think about, you know, gentrification, we have to connect that back into a legacy of like land dispossession that stretches, and you think about locally, that stretches all the way back to William Penn.
Yes.
That's a good point. Yes.
And when we place it in that context, when we think about the changes that need to happen, how does that help us move forward in thinking about a plan? So like that radical meets progressive confrontation is something that has to happen, right? For us to really grow how we think about things. We have to struggle through this, you know, idea of abolition. We have to struggle through this idea, a movement of decolonization, and think about like empire, the American empire. And yesterday we just saw some more empire moves happen with sort of like this Iran nuclear deal, and the next thing you know is bombs over in Syria. So we have to be able to sort of like see it in that grand scale, and really be educated around how the sort of like historical legacy of these things, that we can really make changes in profound and large ways, because that's what we really need right now.
And remembering that in an abolition movement, as you've given us for conversation today, that nothing has to be permanent. I think we're so used to institutionalized racism being being a given in what we deal with, that the fantasy of abolition is something most people can't wrap their brains around. And the thing is that if you get rid of the thing that oppresses you, there should be a vision for how you replace it, and that the abolition does not have to be absolute, that you can walk back from it once something is gone and figure out the balance of what it should be in order to benefit the community. But people are so resistant to that kind of radical change that they don't even want to start walking the path with you. They hear that and they're like, I opt out, especially here in Philadelphia. A lot of people opt out because they cannot do the long ball work of what it means to completely restructure a society to your benefit.
And maybe because it's so racism and prejudice, it's so ingrained into the fabric of our society. And part of me almost thinks that we need to tear down the whole system and start over again, because the foundation was already rocky, right? The foundation was never really that great to start off with. And so there's a part of me that thinks that even though, right now, and this is not to say give up or anything like that, I'm not saying that, but part of me is thinking that, right now in this age of Trump, where we are just continually seeing things getting worse and worse. You're seeing that CHIP is being taken away, and Planned Parenthood is being defunded, and things like that. We're just seeing so much that I almost think that it's going to have to get much, much worse before it gets better. And so there's this part of me that thinks that it'll get to that point where everything just comes crashing down in order for us to kind of rebuild and kind of have that
offers an opportunity.
Right, exactly.
Definitely offers an opportunity.
And I think we have to acknowledge as the people that because of slavery, right, because of continuous oppression, systemic oppression, incarceration, poverty, is that too often we forget that it takes time to actually reconstruct and move forward from what happened for so long. And then the only analogy that I can think that we know for sure was a huge issue was the Dark Ages. During the Dark Ages, when it came to science and technology, people stepped away from it because it was considered to be something evil. We're still dealing with the Dark Ages today when it comes to science and technology, and that was thousands of years ago. So when people say, okay, slavery was so long ago, or this happened so long ago, no, we're going to be seeing the harsh reality and the disadvantages of what happened for a very long time, and it's going to continue to take even more time because, as Kwasa mentioned, we're kind of taking steps back. So people have to be patient, they have to be resilient, and they have to acknowledge that it's going to take a lot of time in order to move forward.
And it's going to take money.
A lot of money.
One of the things that I try to emphasize on the air is that I'm not volunteering for a broke revolution. That there is, I think we have to be conscious, as much as we might critique the capitalist system, we also need to realize that if we are going to dream big, and we are going to set goals for ourselves as a society, we have got to have the power to raise the resources to make those things realized. And it just doesn't happen on a hope and a prayer. It has to happen with hope, prayer, planning, and resources. And we've got to be much more intentional and diligent about putting the resources in place to make the vision a reality.
I think that is also a very good point of this too, and also a great point for a pause in this. I know that we've kind of reached our time limit somewhat for today, but I know this is just one of many conversations that we can have about this, because we're continuing to help define these and have these conversations. Again, if we're not having them, who is having them, right? People have these kind of things, they have these ideals, across an entire spectrum, right? We know we're not a monolith. We get that. We understand that, right? But, understanding, sort of that this progressive movement might, run down the tracks without us, right? It could definitely kind of take on a form that could be intended for us, or could be displayed almost for us, but it's not actually for us. And I think there's a lot of traditional political movements that have done the same thing over the years. And I think, I hope rather a part of these conversations can be helping to define what that means for us, and also, how people can approach this system too. We don't want folks to believe that it's just this way or that way. And if you don't like either way, then I guess you got to go, or you can't participate. We certainly want folks to continue to engage with this process. And we hope that, folks that are listening to this or maybe watching this are able to help also contribute to this conversation. All these voices are tremendously important. And I thank all of you for helping make this happen today. Thank you all for taking the time out. We'll talk to you all again very soon. Definitely want to continue this conversation. I'm your host today, whatever it is, Keaton Nichols. You can find me on Twitter at Keaton D. Nichols, and make sure you check out my show, The Lounge, each and every night right here on WURD Radio, 7 to 10 p.m. Thank you all again, and we'll talk to you again soon.